Stalin's forbidden subterranean tanks beneath the streets of Moscow, beneath the crowds, the trams, and the noise of a city pretending nothing was wrong. Something enormous was being built. Something secret. Something that, if spoken about in the wrong company, could send a man to a labor camp for 10 years. Not a bomb, not a weapon, not a bunker. A tunnel wide enough for a tank. And not just one tunnel, a network. A subterranean empire of steel, concrete, and shadows. Designed to let Stalin move armored vehicles through the earth itself. Unseen by enemies, unseen by the world, unseen even by most of his own people. This is the story of Stalin's forbidden subterranean tanks. To understand why Stalin built tunnels for tanks, you have to understand how Stalin thought. By the mid-1930s, Joseph Stalin had consolidated total control over the Soviet Union. He had survived revolution, civil war, and the brutal internal purges he himself had ordered. He had watched Hitler rise in Germany. He had read the intelligence reports. He knew that war, a massive, catastrophic, possibly civilization-ending war, was coming, and Stalin had a particular obsession that set him apart from most military leaders of his era. He was terrified of bridges, not irrationally so. Think about the geography of the Soviet Union and of Eastern Europe more broadly. The landscape is carved up by enormous rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, the Dniester. These rivers are not gentle streams. They are massive, kilometers-wide barriers that armies have to cross to advance, or retreat, and a bridge, Stalin understood with crystalline clarity, is a choke point, a vulnerability. A single bomb dropped at the right moment and an entire army could be stranded, cut off from reinforcements, from supplies, from escape. During the First World War, retreating armies had destroyed bridges to slow the enemy, and in doing so, had sometimes trapped their own forces. Stalin had no intention of letting that happen to the Red Army, so he asked a question that most military planners would never think to ask. What if the tanks didn't need the bridges at all? In 1938, Stalin issued one of his most audacious and secretive construction orders. 2 massive tunnels were to be bored under the Dnieper River near Kiev, each one 6.5 kilometers long, reaching depths of up to 32 meters below the riverbed. The project was codenamed, with bleak Soviet bureaucratic poetry, Object Number 1. There was a reason for the vague name. According to historians who have studied the project, workers on the site were explicitly forbidden from using the word tunnel in conversation. Saying it aloud, even casually, even in passing, was enough to result in a 10-year sentence in a labor camp. Over 12,000 workers were involved in the project at its peak, and the tunnels they were building were not ordinary tunnels. They weren't for pedestrians or trains or water pipes. These tunnels were engineered to carry tanks. The interior was wide enough to accommodate removable railroad tracks, but crucially, those tracks could be covered with flat steel plates, turning the tunnel floor into a roadway. A roadway that a T-34 tank, the backbone of the Soviet armored force, could drive through, completely invisible, completely protected, completely impossible for enemy aircraft to spot or destroy. Stalin's idea was staggeringly simple in concept and almost impossibly complex in execution. If the Germans bombed every bridge over the Dnieper, and he expected they would, Red Army tanks could still pour across the river, through the earth itself, emerging on the opposite bank to flank, ambush, or reinforce positions at will. The project was placed under the supervision of a man who knew something about building things underground, Nikita Khrushchev, then serving as head of Moscow's enormous subway construction program, and first secretary of the Communist Party's Ukrainian Committee. Yes, the same Khrushchev who would one day lead the Soviet Union. In the late 1930s, he was Stalin's tunnel builder. The Kiev tunnels weren't the only place where Stalin was building underground passages, wide enough to move armored vehicles. In Moscow itself, a parallel and equally secret project was taking shape. Underneath the famous Moscow metro, those grand, marble column stations with their chandeliers and socialist murals, ran a second, deeper system. Soviet officials later called it Metro 2, though for decades its existence was officially denied. This wasn't primarily a passenger line, it was a strategic military network. The tunnels of Metro 2 connected the Kremlin to Stalin's personal bunkers, to military headquarters, to airports outside the city. They were wide enough and reinforced enough to move vehicles, not just cars and trucks, but armored vehicles. Russia Beyond, the English-language publication of the Russian state news agency, has confirmed that among the urban legends of Moscow's underground that turned out to be real were what they described as tank tunnels, underground passages specifically engineered to allow armored units to move beneath the city unseen. Think about what that means tactically. A foreign power monitoring Moscow from satellite or aerial reconnaissance would see troops moving on the surface. They would have no idea that beneath their feet, entire armored formations striking from unexpected directions, or evacuating to new positions without ever appearing above ground. Stalin's bunker, the one built beneath a massive sports complex in the eastern part of Moscow, completed in 1938, was connected to the Kremlin by a 17-kilometer underground road, not a rail line, a road, wide enough for vehicles, wide enough, according to historical accounts, for Stalin himself to be driven by car through the earth to reach safety. The sports complex above it was, of course, just a cover. Legend holds that Hitler's Luftwaffe was ordered never to bomb stadiums, a rumor the Soviets may have deliberately cultivated to protect their underground command center. Every project of this scale required labor. Enormous, backbreaking, dangerous labor, and in Stalin's Soviet Union, labor of this kind came with an additional dimension of terror. The men and women who dug the Dnieper tunnels, who bored through Moscow's clay and granite, who poured the concrete reinforcements and laid the steel plates that would someday carry the weight of tanks, they were building something they were forbidden to describe, forbidden to name, forbidden even to discuss among themselves, except in the most oblique terms. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, maintained a constant presence at all major construction sites. Informants were everywhere. A careless word could mean arrest. Arrest meant interrogation. Interrogation, in that era, frequently meant confession to crimes never committed, followed by imprisonment or execution. The workers built in silence. They built one of the most ambitious underground military infrastructure projects in human history, and they could not tell a single person outside the project what they were doing. Many of them carried that secret to their graves. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft surged across the Soviet border. Stalin, famously, had been warned. His intelligence services had given him detailed, accurate information about German intentions. He had refused to believe it, or perhaps he had believed it but could not bring himself to act, paralyzed by the scale of what was coming. When the Germans reached Kiev in August 1941, the subterranean tank tunnels under the Dnieper were still under construction. In February of that year, a catastrophic accident had struck the project. Compressed air escaped from one of the working chambers into the sandy underground, and one of the tunnel bores flooded with water. Emergency repair teams worked around the clock. And here is the extraordinary detail that tells you everything about how desperate and driven this project was. Even as the Wehrmacht approached and the workers could already hear the sounds of battle from the front, the booming of artillery, the distant crackle of gunfire, they kept digging. They kept building. Stalin believed or hoped that Kiev could be held, and so the project continued even as the city prepared for siege. It was not held. Kiev fell to the Germans in September 1941, in one of the most catastrophic encirclements of the war. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. The tunnel project was abandoned, the incomplete bores flooded, the tanks that were supposed to flow silently through the earth never came. Today, what remains of Stalin's forbidden tunnels can still be found if you know where to look. Near Kiev, urban explorers and guided history tours venture into sections of the partially constructed Dnieper crossings. The entrances are overgrown with vegetation, the walls are streaked with rust and damp. In cold winters, some sections freeze solid enough to walk on. In warmer months, you navigate by boat or canoe through flooded chambers that were once meant to carry steel giants. One of the surviving exit shafts, designated Tidal Number 6, extends 600 meters toward the surface and gives some sense of the staggering scale of what was attempted. In Moscow, Bunker 42, one of Stalin's deep underground command facilities, built 65 meters below the surface specifically to survive a nuclear strike, has been transformed into a Cold War museum. Visitors can walk through the same corridors that Soviet military commanders once paced, imagining the end of the world. In Metro 2, the Russian government has never officially confirmed its existence. Maps don't show it, no timetable listed stations. Former Soviet officials and construction workers have spoken about it over the decades. Their accounts consistent enough to suggest that something is there, but what exactly remains classified? The tank tunnels of Moscow remain, officially, a legend. Stalin's obsession with underground military infrastructure did not end with the war. If anything, the war taught the Soviets to go deeper. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated what nuclear weapons could do to a city in a single moment, the Soviet military command concluded that the surface world was simply too vulnerable. Almost everything of strategic importance needed to move underground. Rocket silos were buried. Command centers descended hundreds of meters into bedrock. The Moscow Metro was explicitly engineered so that its deep stations could serve as nuclear shelters for civilians. The same logic that had been applied to tanks in the 1930s now applied to the entire population of the capital. In Balaclava, in Crimea, the Soviets carved an entire submarine base into a mountain, a facility capable of surviving a nuclear blast, complete with tunnels, dry docks, and water channels, all hidden from aerial observation. That facility wasn't completed until 1961, but its conceptual DNA ran directly back to the underground, thinking of the Stalin era. The Soviet Union had become, in ways that Western analysts spent decades trying to comprehend, a civilization that lived underground. There's something almost mythological about the image of tanks moving silently through the earth. Armored monsters, meant for open plains and crashing through enemy lines, reduced to shadows beneath a river. Invisible, unstoppable, unknown. Stalin was many things. A monster certainly, a visionary in his terrible way. A man so consumed by paranoia that he turned the entire machinery of a superpower toward secrecy. But the subterranean tank program was not the paranoid fantasy of a deranged mind. It was, by the brutal logic of its era, entirely rational. Bridges can be bombed, armies can be cut off, but the earth itself cannot be destroyed. Stalin understood this, and so he tried to put his tanks inside the earth to make them part of the landscape, part of the ground that no enemy could ever truly conquer. The war came too fast. The tunnels were never finished. The tanks never rolled through the dark. But somewhere beneath Moscow, beneath Kiev, beneath the cities that have seen empire after empire rise and fall, and the concrete is still there, the reinforced chambers, the wide, flat floors built for steel treads, waiting. The hands that built these dark tunnels are gone, but their silent stories remain. If this journey beneath the earth moved you, please like, subscribe, and comment below. Together, let us keep these forgotten, deeply buried voices alive. Thank you.